The morning the silence shattered, the entire neighborhood felt it. A convoy of black and white SUVs rolled in like a storm front, sirens muted but lights flashing, casting frantic reflections across windows and lawns. Within seconds, strangers in fake tactical gear poured into the driveway, barking orders, shoving neighbors back, tearing down fences, smashing through the front door as if hunting a fugitive that didn't exist. It was chaos disguised as authority, an operation wrapped in intimidation. But their greatest mistake wasn't the damage, the destruction, or the lies they carried. No, their real mistake was choosing the wrong house. Because the home they raided belonged to a federal sheriff. If you believe power should never be abused, and justice always finds the ones who try, hit that subscribe button. Here, every story reminds us that truth always rises, and karma always knocks louder. The day began with an unnatural stillness, the kind of quiet that feels staged by the world before something explodes into motion. The house sat in the early light, shadowed by the tall maple trees, with nothing to betray the storm that was coming. The air was crisp, the birds restless, and the faint hum of distant traffic the only sign of life. But beneath that stillness, something pulsed, an anticipation that would soon reveal itself in the most violent way possible. The neighborhood had long been at odds with its self-appointed rulers, the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association, a board notorious for power plays and theatrics. They prided themselves on being protectors of the community, though their methods relied more on intimidation than guidance. In recent months, their behavior had grown bolder, more invasive. They questioned landscaping, demanded access to homes for inspections, and issued fines so outrageous they bordered on extortion. Rumors swirled that their president, a woman with a talent for theatrics and a hunger for control, had created her own HOA enforcement team complete with uniforms that looked official enough to fool anyone at a glance. It was an illusion of authority, but today they planned to push their illusion into dangerous territory. At 7:12 a.m. the first sign appeared. A slow-moving SUV crept down the street, tinted windows hiding the driver. It paused in front of the house, idled for a few seconds, then continued. A second vehicle followed, then a third. Each one held occupants dressed in matching black vests with bold white letters spelling three words that didn't legally belong together: HOA Community Police. Neighbors watched from their windows, some familiar with the HOA's antics and others too intimidated to intervene. The convoy made a tight circle at the end of the cul-de-sac before returning, this time stopping directly in front of the target. Home doors swung open in near-perfect synchronization, boots hit pavement, and voices barked commands that echoed down the quiet street. It was a performance, loud, dramatic, and designed to overwhelm. A battering ram emerged from one of the vehicles. The sight of it sent ripples of disbelief across the watching neighbors. Who were these people? What authority did they think they had? But the so-called HOA police moved with the confidence of those who believed they could get away with anything. They formed a perimeter around the yard, tearing down the small wooden gate and ripping up a section of perfectly maintained hedges. Their leader, a tall man with a plastic badge and a theatrically deep voice, announced loudly that the property was being entered due to severe HOA violations and environmental hazards. It was nonsense, but it sounded official enough to intimidate anyone uninformed. Inside the house, morning routines had just begun when the first impact hit the front door. The sound was explosive, a deafening blast that shook the walls and sent a cascade of picture frames tumbling to the floor. The ram struck again, and the wood splintered under the force. The whole house trembled. For a moment, confusion overtook everything. Was it an earthquake? A break-in? Something worse? But the confusion lasted only seconds before training and instinct took over. The homeowner, the federal sheriff whose authority was not for show, moved through the house with calm precision. Adrenaline surged, but discipline held firm. This wasn't a random crime. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was an organized intrusion, and one that was about to collide headfirst with the truth. The door gave way on the third strike, bursting inward as the fake officers flooded the hallway, shouting commands with chaotic energy. They toppled a side table, shattered a lamp, and pulled down curtains as if searching for hidden contraband. They stormed room after room, leaving destruction in their wake, ripping open drawers and smashing anything fragile. Their leader barked orders about evidence collection, but there were no warrants, no paperwork, no legal oversight, just theatrics and destruction. The sheriff emerged at the top of the staircase, boots steady on the hardwood step. There was no fear. Only calculation. Each intruder's face, posture, and equipment were analyzed in seconds. Their gear was mismatched. Their patches were cheap. Their belts held props, not law enforcement tools. They were imposters, dangerous imposters, but still imposters. The sheriff took a slow step downward, every movement deliberate, controlled. As the fake officers tore apart the living room, one of them noticed the figure descending the stairs. He raised his hand and shouted for the sheriff to stand down and comply with HOA police inspection. The absurdity of the phrase cut through the chaos. But before the sheriff could respond, the leader stepped forward, puffed up with false authority, and demanded immediate surrender. That was the moment the sheriff raised a hand, not in fear but to reveal the real badge. A federal badge. Heavy. Real. Undeniable. It gleamed in the fractured light filtering through the broken doorway. And that was when everything changed. The fake officers froze, their expressions collapsing from aggression to confusion to fear. Because now they finally understood whose house they had just invaded. And that's when the sirens, real ones this time, began screaming in the distance. The rising wail of real sirens sliced through the neighborhood like a blade, sharp enough to sever the illusion the fake HOA officers had worked so hard to build. Their heads snapped toward the street in synchronized panic, eyes darting between the shattered doorway, the toppled furniture, and the federal badge glinting in the dim morning light. Time stretched, thick and suffocating, as the facade of their authority collapsed in on itself. What had moments earlier been a theatrical display of fake power was now a crime scene spiraling rapidly out of their control. The sheriff stood motionless on the staircase, framed by fractured sunlight and drifting dust. Calm, steady breaths filled the silence between the distant sirens. There was no rush to speak, no urge to threaten, only a quiet, commanding presence that radiated a truth the imposters could no longer ignore. Their raid had transformed from a spectacle into a catastrophic mistake. Outside, neighbors began to spill onto their porches and sidewalks, phones raised, recording the unfolding drama. The HOA board had long believed fear was control, but now the neighborhood watched with a new kind of clarity. They had seen the intrusion, the destruction, the abuse of power. The fake uniforms no longer looked authoritative, only desperate and pathetic under the harsh morning light. The sirens grew louder, bouncing off houses and echoing through the cul-de-sac. Some of the imposters edged back toward their vehicles, adrenaline shaking through their limbs. Their leader tried to hold onto the scraps of control, barking hushed orders to stay professional and prepare documentation, as if such words could undo the damage they'd unleashed. His voice trembled, the facade cracking with every syllable. He knew the moment those real officers arrived, the entire operation, whatever twisted reasoning justified it, would unravel. The sheriff descended the final steps with deliberate calm, boots crushing bits of shattered picture frame. Each step radiated a silent authority that commanded attention. The intruders instinctively backed away, forming a nervous semicircle around their improperly labeled gear. The sheriff stepped into the center of the chaos they had created, standing among the debris. The leader inhaled sharply, forcing confidence into his voice. He announced that the HOA had jurisdiction over neighborhood infractions and that they were executing a community-issued warrant. The words rang hollow, bouncing off the walls with all the legitimacy of a forged signature. The sheriff didn't respond verbally. Instead, the badge was raised again, unspoken truth weighing heavier than any lecture. Outside, tires screeched as real law enforcement vehicles came into view, blue and red lights flashing with unwavering authority. Doors opened, boots hit pavement, and trained voices filled the air with organized precision. This was the sound of real power, the kind backed by law, accountability, and consequence. The sheriff stepped forward, out of the shattered doorway, arms slightly raised, not in surrender but in clear identification. The responding officers recognized the badge instantly, their posture shifting with respect. Communication was crisp, controlled, and professional, a stark contrast to the chaos caused by the imposters. Neighbors crept closer, gathering in clusters along driveways and lawns. The trembling fake HOA officers tried to blend into their vehicles, their once confident stride now reduced to shaky uncertainty. One officer attempted to casually stroll toward an SUV, as if hoping the moment might simply dissolve behind him. But the sheriff lifted a hand slightly, a silent signal to the incoming units, and two real officers moved swiftly, blocking the fake officer's retreat. The leader's voice cracked as he attempted to explain that the HOA had been acting within its rights. He spoke of dangerous violations, environmental dangers, and urgent enforcement. But the words felt flimsy, barely cohesive. His story shifted with each sentence, scrambling for legitimacy that didn't exist. The professional officers listened without expression, their silence more damning than any accusation. Inside the house, the destruction was immense. Cabinets ripped open, drawers overturned, furniture smashed, belongings scattered like debris from a storm. The sheriff walked the officers through the wreckage, pointing silently at broken locks, shattered frames, and splintered wood. Every detail painted a picture not of an inspection, but of an invasion. Outside, the fake enforcers stood in a pathetic lineup, their cheap badges glinting under the harsh mid-morning sun. Sweat beaded on their foreheads, nerves vibrating through their posture. The sheriff emerged, stepping beside the real officers. The impostors' eyes flicked from the badge to the destruction to the crowd gathering around them. Phones recorded every moment, every twitch, every stammer, every lie. The sheriff didn't need to speak. The responding officers handled the questioning. They asked for credentials, warrants, legal documents, anything that gave authority to storm a home with battering rams and tactical gear. But there was nothing. No paperwork. No legal justification. Only laminated cards printed on cheap plastic and vests purchased from a costume outlet online. One fake officer broke under pressure, his voice cracking as he confessed that the HOA president had ordered the raid. She claimed the homeowner was hoarding dangerous chemicals and violating multiple codes. She insisted this was necessary to restore order. But the story sounded more like a personal vendetta than a community concern. By now, patrol cars had sealed off the street, creating a perimeter around the fake convoy. For the first time, the imposters seemed to grasp the severity of their actions. They had impersonated law enforcement. They had conducted an armed entry. They had destroyed private property. And worst of all, they had done it to someone whose badge outranked every illusion they had fabricated. The sheriff stepped closer to the leader, standing inches from him. The air was thick, tense, humming with the weight of what would come next. The leader's false confidence evaporated. His hands twitched. His voice faltered. And at last, he looked away. In that moment, the sheriff realized something deeper. This wasn't just about a raid. It was about exposing the rot inside an HOA that believed it could manufacture authority whenever it wanted. And this was only the beginning. As the officers prepared to make arrests, a new sound rose from down the street, a single engine revving harder, faster, angrier. Someone was coming, and whoever it was, wasn't slowing down. The roar of the engine came tearing down the street like a warning shot, rattling windows and sending a fresh ripple of tension through the assembled crowd. Heads turned in unison. Neighbors froze mid-recording. Officers shifted their stance, hands instinctively moving closer to their belt. Even the fake HOA enforcers, lined up with pale faces and trembling hands, flinched at the escalating thunder of the oncoming vehicle. It wasn't just loud, It was aggressive, deliberate, fueled by the kind of fury that announces itself long before it arrives. The sheriff stepped slightly forward, posture steady but alert, eyes narrowing as a white luxury SUV whipped around the corner at reckless speed. It barreled down the cul-de-sac, engine screaming, tires biting into the pavement. For a moment, the sunlight caught the windshield at just the right angle, hiding the driver from view. But everyone already knew, there was only one person bold enough, unhinged enough, and angry enough to arrive like this. The HOA president. Her entrance was as dramatic as her reputation. The SUV screeched to a halt halfway onto the sidewalk, inches from the barricade formed by law enforcement vehicles. The brakes cried out in protest, leaving a long burn mark on the concrete. Doors swung open. Camera phones rose higher. Officers braced themselves. And then she stepped out. Tall, composed, and radiating self-importance, she adjusted her blazer with a practiced flick, as if preparing for a press conference instead of walking into the aftermath of a crime scene. Her expression was a mixture of fury and certainty, the look of someone who believed the world would rearrange itself to match her version of events. She took a step forward and lifted her chin, speaking before anyone could challenge her. "This is a private HOA matter," she declared, projecting her voice across the crowd. "You are all interfering with a lawful community operation." The audacity of the statement sucked the air out of the cul-de-sac. Neighbors exchanged looks of disbelief. Officers stood silent, giving her space to dig her own grave. Her gaze snapped toward the sheriff, eyes blazing with righteous indignation, an indignation she had no right to claim. "You," she hissed. "You were warned. You were cited. You ignored multiple violations. You brought this on yourself." But her theatrics fell flat against the shattered doorway behind the sheriff, the destruction visible through the splintered frame, and the lineup of trembling imposters waiting to be processed like criminals. Nothing in sight supported her narrative, yet she clung to it with the grip of someone incapable of admitting fault. The sheriff didn't respond verbally, simply meeting her furious gaze with a calm, measured stillness. It only enraged her further. She stormed forward, heels clicking sharply on the pavement, and jabbed a finger toward the shattered house. "My officers acted within full HOA authority," she insisted. "And we found evidence of—" "Stop," one of the responding sergeants cut in, stepping between her and the sheriff with a quiet, immovable authority. "Your officers are under arrest for unlawful entry, property destruction, impersonating law enforcement, and endangering the public." The HOA president recoiled as though slapped. Her face twisted, disbelief morphing into something darker, rage mixed with panic. "That's impossible," she sputtered. "They were following my directive. I am the elected head of this community. I have every right to enforce." "You have no right," the sergeant corrected calmly. "Not to break into a home, not to impersonate police, and not to orchestrate an armed raid." The crowd murmured, leaning closer as the president's composure fractured. Her breaths grew shallow, her hands began to tremble. But her ego refused surrender. She twisted toward the imposters, shouting at them to correct the misunderstanding, but they couldn't even meet her eyes. Their collapsed posture told the truth. She had led them into a legal disaster, and now she wanted them to shield her from the consequences. The sheriff stepped slightly forward, still silent, but the gesture alone cut through the tension like a blade. The president snapped her attention back, glaring at the real badge with unmasked contempt. "You think that badge makes you untouchable?" she spat. "You think I'm afraid of your title? This community follows my rules. And you," she pointed accusingly, "have been undermining this HOA for months." Cameras zoomed in. Neighbors held their breath. "This isn't about violations," the sergeant replied. "This is about a crime." "Crime?" she repeated, voice rising. "The only crime is letting people like you think you can ignore this neighborhood's standards." Her rant spiraled, echoing off the houses as she raged about order, control, compliance, and discipline. But every word only further exposed her obsession with authority, authority she didn't actually possess. The sheriff remained silent, letting the spectacle unravel itself. Silence, in that moment, was more powerful than any confrontation. The HOA president suddenly lunged forward, shoving the sergeant aside in her attempt to get closer to the sheriff. Officers moved instantly, forming a defensive line as she screamed at the badge, accusing it of corruption, favoritism, harassment. Her voice cracked, spit flying, face flushing red with hysteria. It was no longer the controlled anger of a leader. It was the unraveling of someone who had built her identity on intimidation and was now watching it collapse in real time. When officers tried to guide her back, she jerked away violently, stumbling into the curb before catching herself. Her breath hitched. She froze. Then she saw the cameras. Dozens of them. All pointed at her. All recording. Her face changed. Rage turned to fear. Not the fear of consequences, but the fear of losing her power, her image, her control. And that fear made her dangerous. Her eyes darted to her SUV. Her hand moved subtly toward her jacket, where something metallic glinted briefly beneath the fabric. Officers reacted instantly. Hands where we can see them. But she didn't freeze. She didn't surrender. She bolted. Her heels hammered the pavement as she sprinted toward her SUV, shoving past neighbors, bumping into officers, desperate to reach something. Her door. Her glove box. Her center console. Something hidden. Something she didn't want discovered. The sheriff stepped forward instinctively, reading the intent in her movement, the panic in her stride, the weight of everything she was trying to escape. The officers shouted for her to stop, but she ignored them entirely, fumbling for the handle of her door. She yanked it open, and inside, something metallic glimmered. A weapon. She reached, and officers surged forward. The moment her fingers brushed the metal, everything erupted. The moment the HOA president's fingers grazed the weapon, the world seemed to snap in half. Officers lunged forward, boots pounding against pavement, their voices overlapping in sharp commands that sliced through the air. The neighborhood erupted into motion, people stumbling back, phones shaking in their hands, gasps echoing through the cul-de-sac like a wave breaking against stone. But the sheriff saw something the others didn't. The desperation in her eyes, the frantic calculation of someone willing to risk everything rather than be exposed. That desperation was more dangerous than any weapon she could hold. As the officers reached her, she snatched the object from the center console. For a split second, time slowed. It wasn't a firearm, but a sleek, metallic flash drive, small enough to hide in a palm, yet important enough to send her into reckless frenzy. She clutched it tightly, eyes wide and wild. Her breath came in sharp bursts, her entire body trembling as though the ground beneath her had vanished. The officers seized her arms, pulling her away from the SUV, but she twisted violently, screaming about property rights, legal immunity, and conspiracies. Her voice cracked, echoing across front yards, but no one believed the words spilling from her anymore. The sheriff stepped closer, reading the terror gripping her like a vice. This wasn't fear of arrest, it was fear of exposure. Whatever was stored on that drive was the fuel behind her madness. The officers tightened their hold, securing her arms while she shrieked demands for release. Her blazer slipped from one shoulder, revealing a small holster strap, empty, but still a concerning sign of how far she'd gone to simulate authority. The neighborhood stared in stunned silence, realizing just how distorted her sense of power had become. As she thrashed against the restraints, the flash drive slipped from her grasp, hitting the concrete with a faint metallic tap. The sheriff's eyes flicked to it instantly. One of the officers reached down and retrieved it, holding it up as evidence. The president's face drained of color. She went still, completely still, her voice shuddering mid-scream. Whatever was on that drive held her entire world together. And now it was no longer in her hands. The officers guided her toward a squad car, but she dragged her feet, spine arched, eyes fixed on the drive with predatory intensity. Every step she resisted became another piece of visible truth for the watching neighbors. Their leader hadn't been protecting them. She had been protecting herself. The sheriff stayed silent, observing her unraveling with calm precision. The truth would come soon enough. When she reached the patrol car, she turned, locking eyes with the sheriff in a moment thick with unspoken war. Her voice dropped to a low, trembling whisper that barely carried beyond the officers restraining her. But the sheriff heard it clearly. "You don't know what you've started," she hissed. "You think this is about a raid? This is bigger. Much bigger." But her warning, instead of sounding menacing, carried a hollow, frantic edge that betrayed her. The car door closed, muffling her voice, and the neighborhood released a collective breath. Officers began processing the fake enforcers one by one, reading rights, collecting their counterfeit badges, photographing their equipment. The imposters no longer looked intimidating. They looked like frightened volunteers who'd stepped into something far beyond what they ever expected. Their eyes remained glued to the squad car, where the president sat stiff and shaking, her jaw clenched so tightly the muscles twitched beneath her skin. The ranking officer approached the sheriff, holding the flash drive delicately in a gloved hand. There was no need to say anything, the gravity of it hung in the air like fog. Whatever information the drive contained, communications, plans, evidence of wrongdoing, it was now the key to understanding the motive behind the raid. The sheriff nodded, accepting the responsibility without a word. Officers moved to secure the scene, documenting the broken door, the shattered interior, the damaged property. The destruction painted a vivid map of the intruders' chaotic search pattern. They weren't looking for evidence, they were looking for something specific. Something they believed could threaten them. The sheriff's badge had stopped them physically, but the drive might stop them permanently. The neighbors, once intimidated by the HOA, now approached tentatively, forming small clusters around the police tape. Their faces carried a mix of shock, relief, and betrayal. They had lived under the HOA's iron grip for years, never realizing the extent of the corruption seething beneath the surface. One by one, they offered statements, recounting the HOA's escalating behavior, the intimidation tactics, the unexplained fees, the threats disguised as policy notices. Their voices trembled, but for the first time, they spoke without fear. Inside the house, the sheriff walked through the wreckage again, guided by officers photographing every detail. Dust floated in the air like pale smoke, settling on toppled furniture and crushed belongings. The quiet inside contrasted sharply with the chaos outside. Every broken piece told a story of violation, of boundaries crossed, of a home turned battleground. Yet beneath the destruction beat a steady, unwavering calm, the sheriff's resolve. As the officers finished their sweep, the ranking sergeant approached once more. He spoke quietly, explaining that they'd conduct a full analysis of the flash drive back at the station, but early suspicion suggested financial misconduct, falsified HOA documents, and possibly even surveillance logs. The sheriff listened, expression unreadable, but inside, a tight knot formed. If the HOA president had been desperate enough to impersonate law enforcement to retrieve this drive, the truth it held must cut deep. As the patrol cars prepared to leave, a hush spread over the cul-de-sac. The sheriff stepped outside, surveying the scene one last time. Neighbors watched, gratitude etched plainly in their eyes. But beneath their relief simmered unanswered questions. What had driven their HOA into such madness? What secrets lurked behind those bold accusations of community danger? And how far had the president gone to protect her authority? The sergeant gave a final nod. The fleet of real police vehicles began to pull away, lights flashing silently as they escorted the arrested enforcers out of the neighborhood. The sheriff stood at the edge of the driveway, watching the squad car carrying the president shrink into the distance. But just before the last vehicle disappeared, the sheriff's phone buzzed. A single message. Unknown number. 7 chilling words. You took the drive. We're coming next. The notification's glow felt colder than any warning siren, cutting through the aftermath like a blade. The sheriff stared at the brief message, its 7 words pulsing with intent far darker than anything the HOA president herself had shown. The street was emptying, the last patrol car turning the corner, neighbors retreating behind half-closed blinds, the quiet returning, but not the peace. Something unseen had stepped into the scene, something the sheriff hadn't accounted for. The raid, the imposters, the president, it had all felt unhinged, but at least understandable. This message, though, carried precision, calculation, purpose. The sheriff slipped the phone into a pocket, expression steady but mind racing. Whoever had sent that message wasn't panicked or reckless. They weren't ranting in the street or scrambling for control. They were calm, watching, waiting, and they wanted the flash drive. That single piece of metal had triggered a raid, a breakdown, and now a threat delivered with surgical timing. The sheriff exhaled slowly, grounding the rising storm of questions into focused caution. There would be no assumptions now, only strategy. Back inside the house, the air still held the metallic scent of splintered wood and dust. Broken pieces of the morning lay scattered across the floor, silent evidence of the violence that had unfolded. The sheriff's footsteps drifted across the debris, careful, practiced, measured. Every room told its own story of intrusion, tables overturned, shelves emptied, drawers ripped apart. The intruders had been searching frantically, not systematically. That kind of panic meant the drive was more than incriminating, it was dangerous. The sheriff paused at a shattered window, watching the last slant of afternoon sun stretch across the street. Shadows drifted across the pavement like slow-moving threat. The neighborhood, once confident in the illusion of HOA control, now felt stripped and exposed. And beneath that vulnerability pulsed an undercurrent of fear. Because the threat hadn't ended with arrests, it had shifted hands. Or perhaps revealed its real owner. The sheriff didn't move toward the kitchen where the damage was heaviest, nor the living room with its scattered remnants. Instead, the walk led toward the side hallway, where a small utility room housed a fireproof safe embedded into the wall, reinforced steel, federal grade. With a few careful twists and a coded sequence, the sheriff opened it and placed the confiscated drive inside. The door closed with a heavy click that echoed like a promise. The truth would be revealed on the sheriff's terms, not through intimidation. But even with the drive secured, the sheriff knew the threat wasn't tied to an object. It was tied to whoever had felt confident enough to send that message. Someone beyond the HOA president. Someone orchestrating the desperation that had exploded into violence. Dusk settled in, draping the cul-de-sac in a soft, eerie glow. Porch lights flickered on. Curtains shifted. The sheriff stepped outside once more, analyzing every parked vehicle, every quiet yard, every shadow stretching across the pavement. The neighborhood looked unchanged, but the silence felt wrong. Too still. Too aware. A faint hum interrupted the quiet, the low vibration of a car engine idling somewhere close. Not loud enough to be obvious, but present enough to feel intentional. The sheriff followed the sound down the street, senses sharpened with instinctual precision. The hum grew louder as the sheriff approached a dark SUV parked halfway beneath an old elm tree. Its lights were off, windows tinted darker than legal limit. The sheriff stopped several yards away, boots anchored, posture poised. The engine continued to idle. No one stepped out. No window rolled down. But the air carried a presence, a watchful stillness that confirmed the SUV wasn't simply parked. It was observing. The sheriff stood there, unspoken challenge drifting between silent breaths. For a long moment neither side moved. The sky deepened into indigo. Crickets stirred. A dog barked 2 streets over. And then, finally, the SUV's engine revved softly. Slow. Deliberate. Its tires rolled forward, gliding down the street without urgency. Not fleeing, retreating. Like a predator slipping back into tall grass. The sheriff watched until the vehicle disappeared around the corner. The message had been delivered. Not through words now, but through presence. They were close. And they weren't reckless foot soldiers like the fake HOA police. They were patient, strategic, dangerous. Back inside, the sheriff locked the doors, inspecting the broken frame before sliding a temporary brace into place. The house was compromised physically, but not defensively. Years of training had ingrained layers of vigilance that no raid could shake. Moving into the office, the sheriff sat at a desk positioned against a wall that had thankfully escaped the destruction. A dim lamp cast warm light across scattered notes, reports, and a clean logbook used only for personal investigative work. The sheriff opened the logbook to a fresh page, writing down the sequence of events. The raid, the arrests, the president's panic, the flash drive. And then the message. Every detail mattered now. Every second counted. Because whoever had sent the text wasn't bluffing, they believed the drive belonged to them. A sudden knock cut through the quiet. Not loud. Not frantic. But precise. One knock. Pause. Two knocks. Pause. One final knock. A pattern. A warning. The sheriff rose slowly, each step toward the door silent and deliberate. Fingers hovered near concealed protection, not drawn yet, but ready. Approaching the entryway, the sheriff glanced through the edge of a cracked window. No figure stood outside. No movement. Nothing but the faint silhouette of the street lamp glowing against the evening air. Then another knock. This time, directly against the back door. The sheriff turned sharply. The back of the house was enclosed, fenced, shadowed. Anyone knocking there wasn't a door-to-door neighbor or passing stranger. The footsteps were silent. The warning intentional. Whoever it was had circled the house without being seen. And they weren't trying to break in. They were trying to unsettle, to provoke, to test the sheriff's response. The sheriff approached the back door carefully, body angled, senses sharp. The porch light flickered, likely damaged during the raid, and cast brief, unstable light across the yard. The fence beyond swayed slightly in the wind. The air felt heavy, almost charged. The sheriff stepped closer, examining every inch of the darkened yard. Nothing. But the knock had been real. The sheriff reached for the lock. And the phone buzzed again. Same unknown number. New message. Just 3 words this time. Check your yard. The message hung on the screen like a shadow stretching across the room, short, sharp, and unsettling. Check your yard. The sheriff read it twice, allowing the weight of the words to settle, analyzing the intent behind them. This wasn't a threat delivered in anger. It was calculated, as precise as a blade pressed lightly against the skin. Whoever was behind it wanted control, not by force but by fear. And fear was something the sheriff refused to give. The house lay in fractured silence, the air thick with echoes of the raid. Dust still hovered faintly where sunlight had earlier cut through the wreckage. The sheriff slipped the phone into a pocket and moved toward the back of the house with slow, deliberate step. Muscles steady. Breathing even. Training smoothing the edges of adrenaline. Everything about the moment felt wrong. Not chaotic, not loud, but methodical. As if someone was orchestrating a series of moves on a board the sheriff hadn't yet seen fully. The back door remained locked, a temporary brace now supporting the fractured frame. The sheriff approached it cautiously, stopping before reaching the handle. Instead of opening it outright, the sheriff leaned slowly to the side and peered through the narrow, damaged blinds covering the glass pane. The yard looked ordinary at first glance, quiet, untouched still. But the quietness was what made it suspicious. Even the wind felt hesitant, brushing past the fence in shallow whispers. Long seconds passed before the sheriff unlocked the door but didn't open it. Instead, the sheriff stepped away from it, moved toward the side hallway, and retrieved a tactical flashlight. Its weight clicked comfortably into the sheriff's hand, solid, reliable, made for moments exactly like this. Returning to the door, the sheriff turned the handle slowly, opening it just enough to let a sliver of cool night air slip inside. The porch light flickered, casting a stuttering glow across the yard like a heartbeat out of rhythm. The sheriff stepped out cautiously. Gravel shifted beneath boot. The air carried a faint metallic tang, familiar, unsettling. The grass rustled lightly, but nothing more. The fence stood tall, casting long shadows across the yard. Even the trees beyond swayed in slow, hesitant movements, as if aware of the tension thickening the air. The sheriff swept the flashlight beam across the yard. Left, right, center. Nothing moved. No figure bolted. No footsteps retreated. But something was different. Near the far corner of the fence, a small black object lay half buried in the grass. It hadn't been there earlier. The sheriff approached it slowly, senses sharp as the beam of light revealed the object. A phone. A cheap burner model. Face down, screen cracked. The sheriff crouched beside it without touching it, analyzing every angle. No footprints disturbed the grass nearby. No signs of the fence being climbed. It was placed there intentionally, meant to be seen, not hidden. The sheriff stood, scanning the fence line again. Still nothing. Just as the sheriff stepped closer to examine the burner phone, the sheriff's own phone buzzed again, a vibration so sudden it carved through the quiet like a warning shot. Same unknown number. Another message. Don't touch it. Watch. A chill rippled beneath the sheriff's calm exterior. This person wasn't just close, they were observing in real time. The sheriff's eyes swept across the yard again, taking in every shadow, every angle, every possible vantage point. The flashlight beam caught on a branch, on the fence, on the shed's roof, but no silhouette revealed itself. Another vibration. Turn around. Training kicked in with full, cold clarity. The sheriff didn't turn abruptly. Instead, the sheriff pivoted slowly, controlled, steady. The flashlight beam swung across the deck, the house, the damaged doorway. Then it caught movement. A figure stood across the yard, just inside the shadows cast by the fence. Tall. Wearing dark clothes that blended into the night. Not approaching, not threatening, simply watching. The face was obscured by shadow, but the posture was relaxed, almost casual, as though this entire moment were nothing more than a test. The sheriff held position. Silent. Studying the figure with calculated scrutiny. Seconds stretched long enough to reshape the air around them. The figure didn't move. Didn't run. Didn't speak. Finally, the sheriff addressed the silence, not in words spoken aloud, but in stance. The sheriff stood tall, unfazed, unbroken. It was a response clearer than any verbal challenge. You don't intimidate me. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if acknowledging the silent message. Then slowly, deliberately, it lifted a hand. Something small glinted between the fingers. A remote. A trigger. A device of some kind. Not large enough to be a threat to life, but significant enough to be intentional. The burner phone on the grass vibrated once. Then again. Then its screen lit up, displaying a single message sent through Bluetooth connection. Your HOA president worked for us. Another line followed before the sheriff could process the first. She failed. Don't repeat her mistake. The sheriff's heartbeat remained level, trained discipline holding everything steady even as the ground shifted beneath the meaning of the words. This wasn't just corruption. This wasn't just abuse of power. This was an organized network hiding beneath the thin veneer of a suburban association, a network that had used the HOA president as a tool and now considered the sheriff an obstacle. The figure pressed the remote button. The burner phone sparked, then burst into a small flame, controlled, contained, intentional. The fire lasted no more than 3 seconds before extinguishing itself, leaving behind nothing but melted plastic and charred grass. A message without fingerprints. A warning without evidence. The figure stepped back into the shadows, melting into the fence line like smoke fading into the night. No rush. No panic. Absolute confidence. The sheriff didn't pursue, not because of fear, but because pursuit wasn't the point. Understanding was. And this moment revealed more than any chase could. The sheriff walked back to the house with measured calm, closing the damaged door behind them, locking it out of principle rather than safety. The safe in the wall hummed in the sheriff's thoughts. The flash drive inside it was no longer just evidence, it was bait. And someone wanted to see how the sheriff would use it. In the quiet aftermath, as the house settled into shadows, the sheriff finally allowed one truth to crystallize. The raid was never the real story. It was the opening move, and the sheriff's involvement had transformed a neighborhood feud into a confrontation with something far larger, something hidden, organized, and unafraid. But neither was the sheriff. With the burning remains of the message still smoldering in the yard, the sheriff sat down at the desk, opened the logbook, and wrote 4 words beneath the final entry. "I'm coming for them." The pen lifted. A new chapter of justice had begun.